I'm going to kind of take you through my journey of how I connect with the imagination, and sort of been a little bit of a roller coaster ride, one that I completely didn't expect. I'll just get right into it. This is the place that I work, hills of California. If you go north of LA, when you hit the mountains, there's a whole bunch of buildings there. They call it the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's a place of incredible imagination because it's a place of exploration. And it's a place where people are trying to find new things, discover new things, and with that comes sort of this desire to think ahead of what you're about to go do. And just to give you a sense of what they do, JPL is the Jet Propulsion Lab. It's a robotic space exploration R&D center for NASA. So the people who land the rovers on Mars, who look out into the galaxies to try to understand who and what we are, who send up a variety of many different types of satellites around Earth to give us a better understanding of the thing that we live on and how that works. And it's just a really kind of vibrant place where people have a lot of really crazy ideas, and that's what attracted me there. There was a time, speaking of exploration, where I have to admit I got like a little bit obsessed with Sir Ernest Shackleton, a famous, British explorer of the Antarctic. I'm sure probably many of you have all heard of them. Just to give you an extent of how fascinated I was with this journey that they all went on. Actually, I know how long ago it was. It was 13 years ago, right when I was just starting to work at JPL, and my wife became pregnant. And she said, I think it's a boy. And we went to the doctor and said, okay, well, it's a boy. And I said, I've got the name, Shackleton. It turns out she didn't exactly appreciate that all that much. But I insisted, but I lost. But came up with a much better name. My son's sitting right over there. I'm probably very embarrassed. But what I loved about Shackleton was just the craziness of what he was trying to do. But also, I sort of fell in love with this notion of him putting out an ad in the newspaper, trying to get people to sign up for this trip that was, inevitably end up being, they sort of were doomed, and his whole greatness became sort of the ability to keep all of his people up and to save all of them ultimately. But I just really love this ad. And it turns out, if anybody's from the Smithsonian here, I just read this morning that, nobody's 100% sure if this was actually true, but I don't even care. It doesn't matter because the writing in here is it's like makes my imagination go completely wild. So here's how the story goes. Ad went out in the newspaper, in 1914-ish, right? And men wanted for a hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, right? Oh, yeah, sign up. Constant danger, safe return doubtful, right? This is where it gets good. Honor and recognition in case of success. Isn't that great? So you're looking, you're like, whoa, God, it seems really bad, but can you imagine? Like, what if? Just imagine if that worked out. It would, honor and recognition, and our lives will change, and, and my family will be a hero, and all of these dreams are built into this ad. And, as the story goes, like hundreds of people showed up, men working for, wanted to go on this journey because of that last line, right? So sort of the brilliant thing about it is like, it's probably the most honest ad I've ever seen, but you kind of suck it all up because you're like, well, there will be potential chance for honor, and it's kind of funny. It reminds me of a story. I want to kind of take you back to the very beginning of when I was working at JPL. In a certain way, it was kind of like this. When I look at this ad, you look at all of the danger in it, but that's kind of appealing too. It's like, well, I wonder what that all means really, and how could it, long months of complete darkness? Well, and so, it was just kind of funny thing is, I did hear this it was like a radio broadcast, and some social psychologist was talking. And she said something really funny. She was like, humans, we are like in the, for the balance between hope and despair, we're like 51%, right? And that gets us out of bed and every morning, and like we get up and we're gonna do this thing and do that thing, and on the best, great days, we're like 52, right? So that's like our species, right? Like we're naturally kind of oriented to keep going, right? To look forward, to try to, imagine that next thing of what we're gonna do, and you come up with a plan, and just so that notion that we're sort of naturally built with a very teeny, like 1% advantage of hope, I think probably is the reason why we're all here, right? And I just love that. That last line in the ad kind of reminds me that that's sort of like what we all are. And going back to when I first got to JPL, I became fascinated with the signs, the warning signs that were all around, because it's a functioning laboratory, right? And so the warning signs were just fantastic. And I'm going to show you a whole bunch of them in just a second. But there was one in particular that just like took the cake. It was fantastic. So, walking along on the hillside of JPL, and there's this big wall, and right in the middle of the wall, with no real indication of any kind of rooms in any direction, there was a little keyhole, There's a keyhole, and right by the keyhole, it said laser bypass. And I was like, laser bypass? I'm like, bypassing what? Is it laser outside, or is it on because there was no key in there? And I'm like, well, is it dangerous, or what's going on with this laser bypass? And so this kind of became this fascination of kind of going around and taking photographs of all of these signs. And a friend of mine came to visit, and I was showing him all of these photos and things, and walking him around and showing all this, just the weird lab itself. And he said, hey, can you send me those photos? I want to do something. And the next day, he sent me back this. And I just want to play it for you. It'll give you an indication of what this place is like.
In case of fire, use no water in this building. Laser bypass. Beyond this point, radio frequency fields at this site may exceed FCC rules for human In case of fire, use no water in this building. Laser bypass. Beyond this point, radio frequency fields at this site may exceed FCC rules for human exposure. Caution, roof vents may discharge toxic vapors. This room is supplied with nitrogen. If there is a leak, the air inside could lack enough oxygen to support life. 2 breaths of 100% nitrogen can cause immediate unconsciousness with no warning. Exposure. Caution, roof vents may discharge toxic vapors. This room is supplied with nitrogen. If there is a leak, the air inside could lack enough oxygen to support life.
Yeah, so, I mean, he auto-tuned it like crazy, but it was the funniest thing. The guy's hilarious. Lee Overtree from the Story Pirates. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of them. If you have kids, you should definitely check them out. They're hilarious. But that kind of thing just captivated my attention. I was like, what the heck is going on here? Because first of all, I should say that I am not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. I happen to work in this science institution, but I'm a designer. And my job there is really to kind of create stories and experiences that really kind of talk to people on the inside of the lab and get them sort of like add fuel to the fire of why they're working there, and sort of the passion of like this great goal of what they're trying to do. And then also try to talk about science and technology in a way that just normal people can understand, right? There's a lot of times people jump straight into the nitty-gritty, like hard stuff, but underlying it all usually is like a very simple and very provocative question. And so always looking for those questions to try to figure out, can we do something with it, like an artwork or something just to catch people's attention, you know? And, oh, I forgot, this is the best line. This is near my office. It just cracks me up. I don't have like the big security clearance, so I don't need to like worry about this kind of stuff, but for those that do, you know, don't talk about it in the bathroom. And so just wanted to share with you something that I really love. This was made by my friend Dan Goods, who I work with at JPL. But this is actually a grain of sand in a microscope. And teeny tiny grain of sand, like you just see at the beach, nothing much bigger than that. But he had this crazy idea that he's like, well, I wonder if we could get somebody here at JPL to drill a hole into that grain of sand, just to see if they can do it. And turns out they can, and it's a very teeny little carbide drill bit that drilled a hole into the grain of sand. But this is actually a pretty good representation of an idea of, so if that grain of sand represented our entire galaxy, the Milky Way, right? It's within that teeny tiny little hole. That's where now at this point we've already discovered thousands and thousands of planets around other stars, right? So we're planets around our star, the sun. But the way that scientists have been calculating this is that when you look up in the starry sky, if you're out of the city, there's a really good chance statistically that there are more planets than there are stars, and this was about it's about 20 years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, something like that the very first exoplanet was discovered, and it's called a planet. I'll say this a lot, so I want to describe it. A planet around another star. It's called an exoplanet, which kind of sounds cool too. But there are thousands, millions, billions of potentially exoplanets, right? And also inside that teeny tiny little hole is us. Now, to represent all the rest of the entire universe, you need 60 rooms filled with sand, like think about it, 10 by 10 cubes, filled with sand to represent all of the rest of the stuff that's out there. And we're inside one of them, and that's all we know, right? And it's kind of nuts. So we're small, and we're big at the same time. I found this quote, and it's sort of driven me creatively for a long time because, it's like there are things out there, right? Billions of planets waiting to be discovered. But we can't get to them yet. We don't have the technology yet. We can't get to them. It's just there's limitations, of course, with funding to put telescopes up there to start discovering more. But I love the idea that there's just things waiting for us. But it takes our initiative, it takes our wits to be able to interact with those things. Most things just aren't handed to us. The universe is not going to drive over all of these discoveries to Earth. We got to go figure it out, right? But talk about something that just blows up the imagination is that there's so much yet to be known, right? And this to me is a magical thing, right? I know the word magical, there's all kinds of different ideas of what that could mean. Incredible, unbelievable, surreal, unexpected. This is a European Space Agency image of Halley's Comet. When I think of comets, I think of the tail, right? I don't think of this huge thing on the inside, which is making the tail. And so what that is, it's sort of like a giant mountain of ice. And when that ice, it's this giant rock of ice, gets near a star or our sun, it heats up, and that water turns directly into gas, and it just leaves this trail that gets illuminated by the sun. It's beautiful. In 2014, the European Space Agency was planning to land the Rosetta Mission, I don't know if you guys remember, on the comet for the very first time in history. So comet people were freaking out. They loved what is a comet made out of? What's inside the core? How long can they last if they're continuously spewing out all of this water vapor? And all these questions, but nobody had really seen it close up. Because the Rosetta mission was just about to arrive there. But NASA had 3 instruments on that spacecraft. And so the mission manager was at JPL, and he said, hey, can you guys do something to get people to think about comets? And one of the things I love is I just jumped into that learning curve, right? So I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, but I like cool, interesting things, right? And comets are definitely one of them. And so, trying to figure it all out, what can I make, what can we make, my colleagues, that would get people to think about it? And we started going down the route of all this, very kind of detailed, sciencey kind of thing. But we realized that people kind of don't care to a certain extent because there's always these big questions of like, what's the difference between a comet and an asteroid and a meteorite? And, this is very easy things to confuse. And what we realize is that what makes a comet so beautiful, which is what I've always been attracted to my whole entire life, are these amazing, beautiful comet tails, right? And so we thought, well, we haven't seen it yet, so we don't know what it looks like, but another way to look at it is we had tons of poetic license. And we thought, well, could we just make something that people would enjoy and maybe replicate this moment of discovery? And can we, just provide a place where people could play inside the tail of a comet? And this is what we made. This is a comet brought down to human scale. We imagined it sort of landed down on Earth and started melting its water all over the place. And, it would spew water, this water vapor out of these beautifully cut designs. Worked with an amazing architect, Jason Klomoski, on this. And that's all we did. We didn't explain anything. And we just wanted to see what happened, And it was kind of funny, too, because it was like our research experiment. We were filming everything, just trying to see what people did, what they, how they interacted with this thing. And we kind of had backup because this was at a science festival, so there was a whole bunch of scientists like standing around waiting for people to ask. But they started to ask really interesting questions. And like weird things happened, like people started showing up and doing these dances, and people would come get their wedding photos next to it. And our whole intent was just to create a sort of a beautiful experience that got people to ask questions. And that was our first understanding that, sometimes you don't need to tell people everything. Sometimes it's enough just to get them curious in this world. Because if they don't really care, then they're not going to ask the questions anyway. So we sort of found that there was a little space for us to design things that were more based around questions than answers. And there was space for us to do things that were sort of this entry point into learning or being curious, And so it was like designing for curiosity, basically. And, we call it sneaking up on learning because, you kind of create this thing and then hopefully you're like, well, what is that? And then people are like, well. So, or if you, Google it, just the fact that you're searching for something now was that like a good thing, right? On my second day of JPL, I'm kind of switching all over the timeline, but just wanted to kind of give you this is a collage of, I guess, my life in this playground of imagination, kind of think of it as. That's my buddy Dan. He got a job there first as the artist in residence, and then I started working with him and eventually got a job there too. And he calls me up on my second day, and he says, hey, David, you want to go on a NASA plane to Goldstone? And I said, yes and yes. And what is Goldstone? Sort of sounds like a James Bond movie or something. But I didn't know until we got on this little plane, Burbank Airport, and flew out to the middle of the desert where you see these things. And these are these radio antennae that are pointing out into space. And what's going on here is that the Jet Propulsion Lab owns and manages this thing called the Deep Space Network. And what that is this series of antennae in 3 parts of the world, one in California, one in Australia, one in Madrid. So as the world spins, they can be in continuous contact with all of the spacecraft throughout the solar system, right? So I learned that. I'm like, wow, yes, let's go to Goldstone. So we arrive there, and the weirdest thing happens is you get there, and with the amount of activity that is going on, it becomes really clear really quickly that you have, like our senses are very limited, right? So we have these like really amazing senses for the things we can touch and smell and see, but if you don't have the technology to perceive things in a certain way, you'll miss this tremendous amount of things happening. Our senses were not allowing us to understand the volume of traffic and information that was being transferred back and forth, like a huge amount, right? And that's not something the engineers care about at all, but it was just kind of struck us. That's interesting. And we went home and we were sort of brainstorming of like, how could we like use our given senses, right? Our human senses to interact with technology that's new, that's sort of this extension of our senses. And we started asking questions like, well, I mean, what if we could hear the spacecraft around the solar system? What if they kind of could just say, like, hello, hey, here I am. Or the ones that were really far away were just tiny whispers. And the ones that were close, they're like, hey, you know? And so we kind of had that idea and then put it in our back pocket. And along the way then, we had an opportunity to do a different project. And what this is this is for the director's lobby in JPL. And the way that the data flow of traffic is understood from the Deep Space Network is usually on a very engineering chart that nobody can really understand, right? But it's a very intuitive thing, you know? When you see lights coming down, this is our version of it, we're receiving data. When you see lights going up, we're sending data. And when you see a huge volume of lights coming down, we're receiving a lot of data, you know? And so what this is there every 30 seconds, it changes the mission that it's listening to, and we're just using the live data from the Deep Space Network, which is driving this, to show people that we're communicating right now. And so, you know, it's a range between like, you know, exactly live and like 5 seconds difference, but all we did was set up the parameters to how it can speak to us, and then it just runs on its own, you know? But it's kind of funny is that people walk in and the people who normally wouldn't care to ask about the chart that's on the computer screen inside the room are now like, what's that? You know, what are you doing? And we kind of liked it because this is the director's lobby, and you know, people walk through it all the time, and it's sort of like JPL's. It's working. You know, it's doing stuff. You know, we're talking to spacecraft throughout the solar system, and it's driven by live data. It's happening right now. Then we had the chance, you know, much later on. Oh, and I should say that Dan was the designer of this, and I was the conceptual, you know, support but we had the opportunity to take that other idea of can we hear the spacecraft if they're around the solar system? And there was this thing called the World Science Festival in New York where we did the Comet the year before, and they were like, well, what do you guys want to do this year? And we're like, wow, seriously? And I was talking to Dan, I'm like, remember that idea about listening to spacecraft? And we got a chance to do it. But we had to do it for Earth. The whole theme around this time was Earth. We said, well, okay, we can switch it. You know, maybe it's not about the entire solar system, but NASA has 19 Earth science spacecraft that are circling the globe, right? And maybe we can do something with that, because when you look up in the sky, you see this, right? You don't see NASA spacecraft flying over. And if you know exactly where to look at night, you might be able to see it if the sun is hitting at the right angle, you know, see some reflection. But once again, it's sort of out of our senses, out of our range. And we thought, well, can we do something where if we just look at all of the different spacecraft that are going around Earth, and if we give each one its own unique voice, well, then maybe when they fly overhead, they can just say hi. That was our concept, you know? Let's let them say hi. And so we worked with this really great guy named Shane Mirbeck, who was not only a tremendous composer, but happened to work at Arup Engineering and knew how to do it, you know? He's like, oh, we need an ambisonic sound system. We're like, yes. So, you know, and so what this is it's like a speaker system on steroids, you know? And we have 28 speakers on the inside. If you want to go crazy, you know, you can wrap sound around and just like in circles and you hear the Doppler effect and things like that. But what we decided to do is let it act on its own. So, you know, Shane created sounds for all 19 spacecraft. And he also created a composition with all of them together. And so there's two things that you're about to hear. It's sort of two chapters. One is 24 hours in 1 minute of data, and one is exactly where they are at that moment. And well, here, I'll let you listen to it. And the one thing to know is we spent a lot of time on this to make sure it was right, is that when you close your eyes and you point your finger to where you think the sound is coming from, if you were to continue that line all the way up through the atmosphere out into space, that's where the spacecraft is. So luckily, when you come up with weird ideas and you're surrounded by people who are like know how to do this stuff, they could figure out, well, yeah, sure, we can, we just plot it, we know exactly where it is on its orbit, and we can have that move the sound. And so we were able to do it, and this is it. And it's a really funny thing because it's something that I'm just so thankful that people trusted in us enough to let us take a crack at it, because we explained it to people beforehand, and even we didn't really kind of know exactly how it was going to work or sound. But luckily we got a chance to do it. But the weird kind of side effect after it all, it took us a while to kind of really kind of reduce just down to those simple two things I told you about. But we don't have any information about what is the spacecraft you're listening to. Well, we do have just the name, right? But they're very confusing names, usually an acronym, but it doesn't say what those things are doing or what they're studying or all of the details of the need for Earth science or anything like that. But what we found out is people kind of didn't care, which is great, because they would go there, and what became really kind of obvious in a strange way was that you were just listening to their presence. All you were doing was just imagine if you hear a flock of birds fly over, there's birds. You may not know what species of bird it is and all of those other interesting things, but you get a sense that they're up there. It's sort of like we're allowing for people to have this new superpower of listening to these things that they can't see and they can't, they can hear now. And also wanted to mention, we also worked with Jason Klimoski on that, and he came up with a really cool idea of the seashell, and I love that because, everybody's, used to picking up the seashell and, oh, it's the ocean. Well, this is the seashell that, lets you listen up into space. But once again, an illusion. But it's an extension of your senses. Just a couple more photographs of it. That little thing in the middle there is where we just put an iPad that would just scroll the different names of the spacecraft that were going overhead. And believe me, immediately we had JPLers down there checking it, doing their math, and luckily it wasn't bad. We actually, we even tested it out too, because one of the sounds that's in there is the International Space Station, and that's the one sound that has the sound of human voices in it, and sort of like this choir. I think you might have heard it. It's kind of but the test was occasionally we know exactly when that's going to fly over, and we knew it was going to fly over right over where this is. This is in near JPL in a place called the Huntington Gardens, but it flew right over, and sure enough, we heard that sound. We're like, yes. So that was a good test. Another image of it at night. Beautiful design too, sort of based on the notion of a long exposure of sort of the North Star. You've seen those where you see the North Star stays in one spot and then you see these stripes move around. But also not only beautiful, but a technical solution to, it needed to be exactly 51% porous. At least that's what the architect said. But you're dealing with a dome, and this idea of sound, it could have just been a nightmare of reflected sound. But it ended up being really good. And so I'm back to the grain of sand, right? And the Exoplanet Exploration Office is at JPL. The coolest thing is they literally call the scientists planet hunters. And they're finding them all the time, right? So, but really crazy ones, right? The whole notion is first of all, what's out there? But then, are there any other planets like Earth? And that's a big, giant question, right? How do you compare those things? but they're finding planets that have these really crazy qualities. And please no Q&A of how exactly that happens. We'll have to get a scientist to give you the details on that. But we worked really closely with them in a project I'm about to show you. But they would tell us about planets that would rain molten glass, right? Or planets that are described as like the consistency of styrofoam. Or planets that they call diamond planet, right? I'm like, are you sure about that? Well, it's funny though too, is because they'll make their calculations and they'll make their scientific sort of judgment of what they think the characteristics of that could be like, but it changes all the time, right? And that's one thing is, especially in this field of science, it's like boom, boom, boom. It's changing fast, rapid pace, right? Because new information comes in all the time. Well, it turns out that one of these planet hunters named Sarah Seeger, who's a very famous one, has worked for the Kepler mission and made major discoveries, was coming to visit the lab and was going to the Exoplanet office. And this is a hallway in one of the buildings down in JPL, and that door, you can see sort of the edge of the door at the very end of the hallway. That's the Exoplanet Exploration Office. And so this is classic, typical kind of assignment that we would get in our studio. They'd say, hey, can you decorate a hallway? I'd be like, yeah, sure. And then we go in and we start asking questions and learning about exoplanets, all these different qualities and things. And our mind just starts to immediately imagine what it would be like to be there. Of course, so much science fiction has already been about that, right? So you have sort of this like pre-populated world of imagination that you can compare to. And then there was these posters, these poster racks, and they're sort of a brand new building. And kind of a funny thing about JPL is these were like these pristine acrylic, brand new poster holders. And the majority of JPL are engineers. And I don't know if nobody had an idea of what to put in there, or they just appreciated the sort of cleanliness of it and like didn't necessarily want to disrupt it. But nobody had done anything with these, and so we're brainstorming and imagining what it would be like to travel there someday, and comparing it to like Star Wars and all these things. And we're like, oh, travel posters. And one of the things we really loved about this notion of like travel posters from like the 30s and 40s, American WPA, but so many European ones too, was that it was this beautiful genre that showed you the place, and they did a really great job of showing you exactly what you were going to get, So it'd be like, visit San Francisco, and you see, the cable car with a hill, right? And so we said, okay, well, maybe we should do that. But if we do it, let's just pick like one thing to talk about for each place, And so we started asking ourselves, I forgot I got to do this. So when you look at I'm going to get to that other thing, right? When you look at a planet like this, is an artist rendering, right? You look at, for me, I should say me, because this is what happened. So I look down at the cloud structures and I'm like, oh, that looks really familiar, but it's not Earth. And, I see kind of maybe like an ocean there, and I can kind of imagine maybe what it would be like to be there. But it's still an artist rendering. But we were just fascinated by listening to all the different characteristics that the scientists were telling us. And we started to test each other to figure out if we could represent some of the characteristics of planets, or if we'd throw in some real ones in there too. And we started this game. It was called Is It an Exoplanet? Do you guys want to play? All right, so here we go. Number one, is it an exoplanet? No? Are there any yeses? Frying pan? No, it's hamburger bun. Is it an exoplanet? It's an avocado. So I think we really quickly realized that nobody knows what these things look like, and that just gave us even more kind of freedom, because when you see something like this, it just very well may look like this, because nobody can say that it doesn't. It's just as likely, right? So we were just screwing around, but it made us realize that maybe one thing that we shouldn't do is try to represent it as though it were realistic. And that was yet another reason why, kind of working with that sort of the beloved genre of those illustrations in those travel posters, it seemed to make sense. And, once again, there it was. And we started asking ourselves questions that sort of became the fundamental concepts that drove each of the first three posters. If you have two suns, would you have two shadows? I don't know, right? If you have sort of plants and forests that are somehow, evolved on or grown on a planet around a red star, two things. One, just everything just look red, like you're in a dark room, like red. Or, can plants evolve to photosynthesize and reflect a different color? It's just kind of an interesting question. We didn't know. Or if you're on a planet with like a huge amount of gravity, they call them super Earths. You think about an Earth-type planet, it's like 3 times bigger. What would you do for fun? Falling, probably, The only thing we could think of for that. But then we ended up creating these, right? And it's just kind of fun. It was really tongue-in-cheek. We weren't trying to like really get too serious about it. Where your shadow always has company, Kepler 16b. Where the grass is always redder on the other side. I know, it's really bad. Or, just the super Earth, this notion of falling. And we just wanted people to walk away remembering one thing, And that sort of, we did it and it all worked out. And the irony, though, is I don't think Sarah Seeger ever even saw them, but later ended up using them in her TED Talk, which is kind of cool. But one of the weird things is once we released them to the public, like people started freaking out, And it was really interesting because when we did these, we were decorating a hallway, right? And but it's the interest that I think is held within these is not just in their execution, which is really nice. And I should mention Joby Harris was the illustrator who did all of these, all the illustrations for it. But it was kind of crazy. We released them, and there were over 1,200,000 downloads in the first week, and almost shut down the servers. Everybody was calling, going, "Wow, this is amazing!" And even like Russian Esquire did a whole piece on them, and then had a designer change everything into Russian, which is kind of cool. But I think the power of these is the fact that there is now some sort of connection between like science fiction and reality. It's the beginning of a bridge, and it's just like we're one step closer to that, and it's just like this really powerful thing. It's like there's so much imagination built up. But now we're just one step closer. We know that there's thousands of planets out there already. And someday, maybe we can go. Who's to say we can't? Someday, maybe we can go. The closest one is 4 light years away. A lot of them are much, much farther than that. And we discovered that when you do things for NASA, it's public domain, and there's this whole world of people that are willing to take it and sell it like crazy. So we'd look on these like websites and we're like, oh yeah, cool, a tie today, Or yeah, I need a guitar pick. And it was just kind of a funny thing. And I was gonna get this for Joby actually, and not that he needs it or anything, but I was just kind of laughing. The only thing that made us a little bit ticked off, because we know the world we're in, we're not trying to like make a ton of money, but we just wanted it to be like a little bit more expensive. It's like, well, they're worth a little bit more than that. It was kind of a funny thing. And so I should say we went on to do a whole bunch more. They're all for free at high resolution. If you go onto the JPL website, you can download them all. I won't show them all to you today. But it led to a different project. And we started with like kind of building on this idea of like imagining the future. What does that mean? How does it relate to what you're doing today? Because actually within the lab, these were meant for within the lab. People started loving them there. It sort of brought out their dreams of science fiction. A lot of people started talking, having conversations about it's the reason why they started working there in the first place, because when they saw Star Wars for the first time, or just this sort of like started to blend these worlds of science and technology and science fiction. And we started to realize, well, that's kind of a really interesting combination, this tension in between this whole group of amazing people who are trying to build a future leading to that direction, and then this notion of like imagining sort of the goal, sort of the carrot on a stick in a way of like what life would be like there. And so you're making these ideas tangible, and so people can see them and appreciate them, which then has like a feedback loop to the now, which kind of gets people excited to do what they're doing again. And so once we saw that relationship, there was a change of the director at the time at JPL, and the previous director had given all of the posters to everybody at the lab. We designed a calendar for them. And the new director said, okay, well, can you do something again? And so what we realized is that, well, what could, at the time, there's this huge amount of work going on at JPL2, and so everybody was like just stressed out, and everybody's working hard to try to get all of these things done. There's also kind of a funny thing, sometimes it's kind of hard for people to explain what they do there, because it's sometimes fairly complicated. And so we thought, well, let's just look at all of the things that people are studying and actively trying to achieve, This was 2 years ago. And let's imagine those things, the completion of those things, but not in a way that they expect, in a way that's just a little bit more fun, right? And so here you see, the top picture is Enceladus, that's a moon of Saturn, has these jets that are coming out through the ice. It's covered with ice. And the reason why this is interesting is because underneath the ice is a huge ocean that scientists think could be a place where life exists, right? Same thing with Europa. If you look at the bottom picture, Europa is interesting. It's a moon of Jupiter and another icy moon, but has basically the same size as our moon, but has 2 to 3 times more water than all of Earth, These deep, deep oceans. And we're thinking, well, I don't know, what can we do with that? And so we thought, well, what if we were, once people are traveling there, so we already did that, what are you going to do for fun? So we thought, can we make some clubs and societies of the future? It's sort of like, you sign up for a club, you like softball or baseball or whatever it may be. Enceladus Hockey League, it's covered with ice. The danger of skating through the geysers, or Europa Scuba, right? Which is kind of everybody's dream at JPL anyway, to get down there inside the water. And so it was all very tongue-in-cheek, and when you look at things like Jupiter, this is the Juno spacecraft, CG version of it. But the bottom picture is an image taken by that spacecraft. That's real, and that's one of the poles of Jupiter. And everybody knows the big red spot, right? But you look at Jupiter, and it's just this enormous landscape of storms that just are bigger than Earth, and they're raging out of control. And so we said, oh, great, Jupiter storm chasers. And we have really complex and powerful telescopes that are going up. James Webb is on the top. Hopefully that happens soon. Another one, W1st. Both of these are they do many things, but one of the things these are both going to do is help us understand what dark matter and dark energy is. Crazy stuff. Nobody can fully explain it, but it's known to be out there because the mathematics scientists think something needs to be there to account for all of the math that they can't explain, right? And so, of course, it's a secret order of dark matter and dark energy. And the funny thing is on the back of all of these, I don't have time to show you, but each one has this really funny write-up about the qualities of what it would be like to be there, and we stayed in character, and sort of just imagining being there and what you'd have to do to sign up. Waivers required, of course. But the write-up for the secret order was secret. And actually, so on these, I'm not showing them here, but the ones we handed out to JPL, there was secret kind of messages hidden within each one. And still to this day, nobody's figured out the secret message that's hidden behind there. And I made it, so I know. Let's see here. I should actually back up, and I just want to kind of give some attention to one of the things I really love is I'm able to luckily work with amazing people, illustrators, people like Always With Honor, and I did the Europa Scuba, but Joby Harris, of course, and Tobias Van Schneider, and a whole bunch of people. We just kept on making them. We had a whole bunch of them. We ended up making 12 designs and handed them out as a swag pack to everybody at JPL. So, they could hand them out to their kids and friends, and people would say ultimately oh, what's that? And you're like, oh, and then it's a story. It's sort of an entryway into the story of what they're doing in a fun way. Proud to Be Human was a celebration of the 40th anniversary of Voyager. Titan Rowing Club, these seas of liquid methane on the moon Titan. Proxima B City College, Proxima B is the planet, Earth-like planet 4 light years away. So in the future, if you want to keep your kids near you for their college, if they're not ready to go to Trappist One University, Proxima B City College. So it was all just fun, we're messing around. But it was a way for people to communicate and have fun about what they were doing. And we'd see this kind of thing all over the places. People would put them on their laptops and give them to friends, and it sort of decked out what they were doing. And this was my favorite. One of them is the European bumper sticker to say where you're from. But as you're traveling in the solar system, you got to represent Earth, right? And so that was kind of fun. And people started dressing up for Halloween, making their own T-shirts, becoming in character. And the one that I think really kind of affected me the most was I made this patch that came along with the set, and we took the John Muir phrase, the mountains are calling and I must go, and just modified that. The stars are calling and we must go. But there's this really famous engineer. You see the bottom of her hair here. But she, is one of these people who had just an amazing kind of trajectory in her life, overcame just a number of different struggles, and was one of the main people who got us to Mars and landed on Mars and figured out how to do that. And they were going to do a big feature story about her at JPL. And the photographer asked her to bring one thing that she felt represented what she does. She brought that. Isn't that crazy? I couldn't believe it. I was so, because we were hoping that we can connect with like something that's real. We don't want to recreate, we like to have fun and like just mess around and do jokes and things, but like underneath it all, it needs to be like real, emotionally, understandable and true, or, emotionally real. And so this is the Nagin looking down at her patch. Best compliment I think I ever received. And, I don't know, this is a really great indicator of how old I am. But when I was a little kid, I loved these things, these books, Choose Your Own Adventure. And it was so cool because, you'd read one part and then it said, if you want to do this, go to this page. If you want to do that, go to that page. And I became sort of fascinated with these decision trees of how to kind of get through an adventure, And to me, it was really kind of cool because it became sort of this call of the imagination once again. You start, thinking about where you are, and then, you think about where you could be, right? But then you think about, well, what if I made the other thing, the decision? Where would I be then? And so you're sort of thinking about these multiple potential futures that exist in the world of this one book. And, and then it makes me realize, well, this is very similar to our lives, right? We all have multiple potential futures in our, what's going to happen after this, tomorrow. So many different things can be expected or unexpected. And this is where I just wanted to bring up that, when I'm thinking about all the playfulness and hope and desire that's held within our capability to imagine, a lot of times imagination is presented in sort of the Disney way, right? But there's like also the very practical way, like we need to think about, where to get coffee, or what are we going to do today, or how are we going to solve that problem? Critical thinking, problem solving, invention, and learning, we found out that is just incredibly powered by the imagination. And for a number of years when I was at JPL, I worked with kids, and I traveled around the country and did this project called Imagine Mars. And we would ask the students to imagine living on Mars in the future. And they would work with NASA scientists and engineers and sort of look at all of the different constraints that the environment had, and then design things for that place that they would actually like to have, right? And so it became this incredibly open project. I traveled to cities all over the United States, working with kids, mainly inner city kids. But time after time after time, I realized that these students would blossom because they were working in an area where there was no wrong answers. They were working in an area where their imagination actually empowered them to like have their own ideas, their own creativity. There were no teachers who could tell them that something was right or wrong. It was either it was more like guides who could say, well, scientifically, this is what this place is like. And so there was sort of that reality to deal with, but their creativity was never right or wrong. And so this is one of my favorite groups of kids that we ever worked with. They're in South Chicago. We were doing an architecture project with them. We were partnered with Housing and Urban Development, which is a government entity in the United States that builds housing structures all over the place. And usually it's a place where people are trying to get back on their feet, or it's not necessarily always the nicest place, right? But there's usually a lot of kids, and all of these different places had computer centers, and so that was our hook. We said, all right, cool, we can teach computer skills, right? Teach science, technology, computer skills, but it became like so much more than that. And we were teaching the kids architecture. They were using basic architecture, SketchUp, to design their cities. And there was really this special group, and I'm about to show you them. But they came up, and they were going to do a completely different assignment that I had given them, which was like design their community in this architectural rendering software. And they said, yeah, they called me up, Mr. David, we like your project and all, and we've done work, but we wanted to know for our final if we could do something different. I said, sure, what do you want? He's like, we want to make a song. So in their computer center, they had some like GarageBand, right? And I said, yeah, sure, go for it. And they sent it to me, and it was amazing, just amazing. It was not only just poetry, which means the construction of and the meaning held within it was like just concise and interesting, but you could tell that they knew what they were talking about. Like they were kind of folding in references to very complicated ideas about what it would be like to live on Mars and how to fix things for themselves there. But they did it in their way. And so luckily I was able to talk somebody in at JPL who's a filmmaker to fly back out with me to make a little music video for them. And probably won't have time to do the whole thing, but I wanted to give you a taste of what these kids can do when they had access and support to completely use their own imagination.
We done made a habitat, how they figure that?
Okay, people, it's about that time. Shot City, step back, relax, about to go to Mars. Earth, bye-bye, this is our new home. Before we can leave, we have some little...
Come on, man. Come on, go slap me around.
Seatbelt, follow the object in your seat at all times. And it seems like we're about to blast off in 5, 4, 3, 2,
You got it, man. You can do it, brother.
blast off. Okay, come off the ship, people. We done finally made it here. Yeah, I know it's cold, but just come out of the habitat, you're gonna be warm. So check this out.
Okay, people, whole time we done had it fronted, took things for granted, but now we gonna show them run it. It's a cold planet, so we doing damage. Put on your boots and spacesuits, we about to go ham it. We done made a habitat, how they figure that? So we about to go and show them how to live on that red planet. Man, it's oh so cold. You think it's hot, but we like nope, it's froze. So froze, okay. Now get out the ship. We up in this habitat, earth nowhere near. Plant them trees so we can cultivate them right. I can take up on your backs, inhale and take flight. You're gonna be warm when the surfaces at night. King James about to show you the how-tos of new life. Drill for water, the solar circuit on. Earth bye-bye, cause Mars our new home.
Bye-bye Earth, we off to Mars. Survival 101, King James going hard. 7-month trip, yeah I know we going far. But we got them bars, no worries now. Cause Shaq Sound Works, we about to show you.
Alright, people. We done been here for about 3 months now. Y'all know how the rotation. So set up the UV lights on the water, set up our home, and we about to throw it to Q.
I can't feel my feet. I'm on my way to Mars, so I guess I ain't gonna sleep. Third gravity got adjust for about a week. I'm about to go to Mars, so I guess I have to do the peak. No oxygen, no clouds, technology ain't right, so I'm keeping up with the Joes. No food, no phone. I'm so far gone, so I'm in the mother's phone.
Bye-bye Earth, we off to Mars. Survival 101, King James going hard. 7-month trip, yeah I know we going far. But we got them bars, no worries now. Cause Shaq Sound Works, we about to show you.
Shout out to John, I can. Tremaine, y'all see. Wesley, I see. Media with we gotta make spaceships, no more pods, man, and thinking about the earth, cause we on our way to Mars, man. I never was a heat when I was another couple bars, yeah. Jumping real high, grabbing stars like I'm Tarzan. Spaceship 0300, so we got the name is Spartan. Parking on the roof like we got valet parking. My own biodome, man, another glass of stone. We gotta hurry up and leave before we turn it to some bones. Sitting at the top is the media with us home. We accomplished so much, we only 5 being strong. Other programs are nothing but a couple clothes. They still on Earth while we building ozone.
Bye bye Earth, we off to Mars. Survival 101, King James going hard. 7-month trip, yeah I know we going far, but we got them bars, no worries now. Bye bye Earth, we off to Mars.
I'm just gonna let it play.
Survival 101, King James going hard. 7-month trip, yeah I know we going far, but we got them bars, no worries now. Bye bye Earth, we off to Mars. Survival 101, King James going hard. 7-month trip, yeah I know we going far, but we got them bars, no worries now. Cause Shaq's
We have my account. I'd like to thank Dave, Miss Griff, and all the other people who are responsible for bringing astronomy into our community. I never thought astronomy would be in the stock. I talk about it all day, all day, all day.
Oh my God, I never thought it'd be this old. Oh my God, oh my God, my hip.
Yeah. I love those guys, I'm telling you. I haven't watched that in a while. Man, oh man. Oh, and I should say, because all the things that were inside, so you saw their SketchUp models kind of moving around and things in there. So, I mean, they did the work. They did the work, and but this was extra, totally on them. And we were super lucky to get some of these the spacesuits that were being lent out by a different company. Man, it was just so great to see the investment of like what can happen when you care, you know? It's like they were doing it, you know, I know kids in school care about a lot of things, but you could tell they really cared about that, you know? And it was their project. Well, in our project, they did it. And it was just great. Oh man, so Mike was talking this morning. The best talk. Speaking about Carl Jung, it was sort of not in my head the whole time. I'm like, yeah, me too. I think that too. You know, but I've always loved this quote about you know, imagination, and it seems obvious, right? But it's not something we think about that often. You know, that just the incredible, profound relationship between creativity and imagination, and you know, it just makes me realize that I'm gonna end up right here. We only have a couple minutes left, but I've learned a few things through this. This has been my journey over 14 years at JPL. Is that you know, we're living in a crazy world. A lot of things to be scared about. You know, just turn on the news. But there is a way for us to deal with that, and it's by continuously being creative, trying new things, expressing yourself, and not being bogged down by sort of the crushing hold of fear. Somebody's going to have to sort of step up, right? And try to do something, and that is only going to happen through creativity. And so creativity, curiosity, it can outgrow fear. I mean, I feel like you know, I waver all the time, but probably just like everybody else. But that's one thing I learned, is that there's hope, right? Another thing I learned is that we do this as designers. We give and we get, and everybody does this as parents, as people, as humans. We give and we get permission to imagine. It's like this hidden commodity that exists out there. Is that, believe me, you'll know when people take that away. You can sense it, but you can also give it. And there are reasons to feel proud to be human. We're not this completely horrible set of people, right? We all have, you know, all of us, we have this kind of duality, dark side and a good side. But when things happen, you can tell when you hear about it and you're like, wow, you know? And so it needs to be more of like a domino effect, right? Like when the rover lands on Mars, right? This is a perfect example is that, you know, everybody is like, we've been planning for this for years, but when it happens, you can't believe it, you know? But you don't feel proud to be like an American. You don't feel proud to be like a guy. You don't feel proud to be a girl. You feel proud to be human. It's like, we can do this now. Like all of us, we can do it. And we also have the opportunity to do our own things that share those ideas. Because it's not landing on Mars. It happens in so many different areas. We need to raise those things up as designers, I think. And you know, and any kind of creativity that you do. I'm going to leave you with this. My time is just up. This is a close-up video of something called a cloud chamber. You can Google it and figure out how to make it. They're very easy to make, in fact, but they do something, no matter where you are in the world, they do the same thing. And so basically, it's a cloud that's created of alcohol, rubbing alcohol, right? And you see these sort of falling particles of alcohol vapor. And through it, do you see those little streaks that are coming through? Those are the remnants of an exploded star that have come from billions of miles away. They're going through us right now. They're here in front of us right now. You just can't sense them. You can't feel them. You can't taste them. But you set up this thing and you realize no matter where you are, doesn't matter. You go into a basement, they're still going to come through. And they're showering us all the time. These little particles are us to a certain extent, right? We're made out of all of that stuff from an exploded star, everything around us. You know, and I know you've heard all of that before, like we're stardust. But the reality is that it's true. And somehow, all of that stuff, we've somehow been able to, you know, be human. And that stuff has been traveling through the, you know, space for billions of years, some of it, smashing into our atmosphere, raining these things down. Who knows what's going to happen? There's all these theories about what happens when you die and so many different things. But somehow we are this sort of, you know, collection of this exploded star, right? And we have a chance to do something with it. Nobody can tell you exactly what's going to happen after you die, but I'll tell you what, everybody has a chance right now to do something special with this unbelievable, impossible reality that we exist. And curiosity, creativity, I think it's going to change everything for us, but we have to not be fearful about it, and we have to go for it. And so the stars are calling, and let's go. Thank you. Thank you.